Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Z370 Micro from EVGA. This is like I actually like this as far as the this is one of the most interesting MATX boards on Z370 in my opinion, because there's a relatively solid VRM, and it's also kind of looks like EVGA geared it for extreme overclocking. And so we're going to go over some of the features before we get into all the VRMs. Starting up here, there's a postcode, reset power, dual BIOS. Your BIOS chips are right here. They're soldered onto the board, not socketed, so don't brick both of them. Basically, just if you're gonna brick one, brick just one. If you brick both, you're still screwed. Though admittedly doing that in general, like bricking both BIOSes is really, really rare, though I have heard of people do that. So yeah, worth pointing out. The board also has a 5-volt standby LED down here, memory error LED, CPU error LED. So the memory and the CPU error LEDs are, in my opinion, kind of pointless because you have a postcode which does everything both of those do better. What else is there? Oh, you get a speaker down here for your beep codes, and then you have an external clock gen right here for enhanced BCLK range and stability. There is a hole in the middle of the CPU socket for this for putting a thermocouple through. So that's if you're on liquid nitrogen. The built-in temperature sensors don't work below 0. Basically, you go below 0 and your temperature readout just sort of stops there. So if you want to actually check the temperature of the CPU itself, or at least the CPU package, because obviously it's not like you're going to embed that thermocouple inside the actual die, but you will at least be able to measure the temperature on the back of the CPU's PCB, right opposite of the die. So that can be pretty handy for, figuring out what temperature the actual chip is at on LN2. Though, funnily enough, I've not really seen anybody actually take advantage of this. Like, I'm not aware of anyone who's ever used this hole in the socket. So, or at least I don't know anybody tell me that they've used this hole in the socket of a motherboard, even though this is a feature on a lot of extreme overclocking boards. Yeah, like people actually using it seems to be really, really rare. Now, down here you get an extra 6-pin power connector for your PCIe slots, which on this board I'm going to say is completely pointless because you can't run 3-way or 4-way on this motherboard, so you shouldn't be able to overload the 24-pin. I mean, it would, you might see some, like, it would lower the operating temperature of the 24-pin connector if you have this plugged in and have 2 GPUs and that pull a lot of PCIe slot power, so like RX 480s, reference RX 480s without the power balancing enabled in the driver. Then this might be ever so slightly helpful, but even then you should be fine just off of the 24-pin. It's really only in 3-way and 4-way setups where you have to worry about the 24-pins 12-volt connections melting, because there's only 2 of them, so it can't exactly push a ton of power. We've done that. Clock gen we've also done. CPU socket we've done. And up here there's a clear CMOS button right there. So even if you have the motherboard inside a case, that's actually very easy to hit. The other thing that makes this board kind of extreme overclocking focused is, of course, that it is 1 DIMM per channel. Now, there's kind of two reasons why it's ended up like this. I do believe that EVGA actually did this for the sake of memory overclocking, but there's also the fact that the 24-pin's at an angle and that they pushed it in, and you kind of can't fit 4 memory slots here. But I feel like the 24-pin wasn't the driving decision behind having 2 memory slots. I think they did the 2 memory slots and then moved the 24-pin afterwards because, well, the other way around, like, normally, at least for most motherboard manufacturers, losing memory slots is just like a big no-no, because memory slot, like, a bigger number is better, always better. So having 4 memory slots is better than having 2, unless you're looking at memory overclocking performance, because in that scenario, if you have a good trace layout and a solid BIOS, you also need a 2 memory slot motherboard, because if you have 4 memory slots, just the existence of those extra memory slots, due to how the DDR4 memory slots are wired, actually negatively impacts your overclocking performance, because the extra memory slots add a ton, like add some parasitic, basically parasitics to the memory traces, because those traces a lot of the traces are actually parallel. So they go to both memory slots, and just having this unused memory slot sitting on the trace for no reason screws with signal integrity by basically just being there. So for best memory overclocking, you want less memory slots, which this has. So yeah, and then the last thing that they've done that sort of gears this towards being an extreme overclocking board is they did add the extra 4-pin power connector for the CPU, which you don't need this unless you're on liquid nitrogen, because a 6-core Coffee Lake on ambient cooling is not going to pull enough power to really put any strain on the single 8-pin. But if you were on liquid nitrogen, this might actually come in handy, as I don't actually know what a 6-core, what an 8700K at like 6.8 gigahertz, 1.8 volts pulls. But I imagine it should, I have a guesstimate that it's around 400 to maybe 500 watts, but it's probably more around 400. So yeah, and also when the 8-core comes, then this actually becomes even handier, even more useful when you're on liquid nitrogen. So yeah, and the funny thing is, this extra 4-pin power connector, they don't have it on the FTW-K motherboard, which the FTW also doesn't have the clock gen, so it's like, or the hole in the CPU socket. So it seems like EVGA basically has the classified, has all of the extreme overclocking features that this has, and then there's this thing that has all the extreme overclocking features, and then there's the FTW, which doesn't have them. And so that's just kind of interesting that it does seem like this was honestly like a intentional decision to like make a motherboard more targeted at overclocking rather than the usual gaming focus that EVGA has, because most of their motherboards, it's like they're not what I would consider exceptional. But with the X299 Dark, they made a motherboard like I'm really impressed with, and then this thing, when it got announced, I'm like, whoa, they might be starting to take I might be getting serious about pushing out some seriously good motherboards. And yeah, so this kind of looks like they are. And actually, for Z390, there's a motherboard from EVGA coming that I am super excited for. So this is like, yeah, this is good to see. Now, Rave did tell me about the memory overclocking performance, and it's not exactly incredible, though I don't know how good his memory kit is, but he was basically maxing out around sort of 3900 CL12, which it's good, but it's not incredible. Like, incredible would be doing something like 4200 CL12, except the problem with 4200 CL12 is that you need a really good CPU, you need a really good kit of memory, and then you need a really good motherboard, and then you also need to actually be, in a lot of cases, it's not just like the motherboard won't even be able to do everything on its own. You'll have to manually fine-tune a lot of things. So that makes it really, really hard to say if the 3900 CL12 limit there is the motherboard, or if it's the CPU, or, the memory kit. Though he did say he did manage to get 4000 CL12 posted a few times, though it was incredibly unstable. So yeah, though there is though he did also mention that there's, when posting the 3900 CL12 settings, this board actually is extremely slow to start. As in, it takes forever to boot up, like almost a minute to get through the post process, just because the memory trading process takes so long for 3900 CL12. So yeah, but it does look like EVGA actually wanted this to be a, extreme overclocking focused motherboard, though I'm not sure if they went, if the BIOS is completely there. Now then, let's talk about the VRMs. The Vcore VRM is this right here. So that's your Vcore. And then this right here is the VCCIO, is with all probability VCCIO. And then this down here is probably VCCSA. And at this point, somebody's probably going to ask, where's the iGPU power? Well, that's the thing. There isn't an iGPU power because this motherboard doesn't actually have any display outs for the iGPU on the CPU, which I'm a huge fan of because getting rid of literally like 2 phases and an extra voltage controller just because, you know, just by not using the Intel iGPU, which most people don't use the iGPU at all, which there are some, you know, use cases where the iGPU does come in handy, in which case you just shouldn't get this board. But for everybody else who doesn't care about the iGPU, this is great because EVGA has basically managed to cram, well, basically managed to save some costs on you know, leaving out the iGPU power, and it basically lowers, and it's actually quite significant what they've managed to do. So you lose the 2 phases that you normally have for your iGPU power, but it also does one other thing. It saves an extra voltage controller because the VCCIO up here, that has its own little voltage controller right there. And the VCCSA, or at least what I assume is VCCSA, these 2 could be like switched around. Like one of them, like I could have them the wrong way around, but VCCSA tends to pull more power than VCCIO. So VCCSA should be this one down here. The VCCSA gets to be on the 35201 instead of having its own voltage controller, which again would add some extra cost. So yeah, it's just a kind of interesting decision, and a decision I fully support because I've never used the iGPU on any of my Intel chips, I don't think. Like, of the Intel chips that have the iGPU that I have, I don't think I've ever run it. Which is, yeah. So, I totally support that decision. I don't care about iGPUs. So, let's get into more details about the Vcore VRM. So, the Vcore here looks like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 phase. It is also advertised as an 8 phase, but if we look at the back of the board, we see these chips. And we see 4 of them. And I don't know what exactly they are. I assume they are International Rectifier 3599s because that is a really common doubler to use with Infineon components, which Infineon owns International Rectifier. So this is technically an Infineon part. So the IR35201, and then these power stages right here, which are there from the DR MOS family of products. So it's not like Infineon also makes for International Rectifier, makes POW IR stages, but these are branded as DR MOS, so it's like a different family of power stage they make. And I think these are targeted at being like more compact and lower current capabilities. So these are TDA, actually no, it's not really. It's just a different family of products they have. I didn't really study them that much, so as for like for the differences that they have. So these are TDA 240s, and that basically gives away the doubling scheme because this being a power stage literally just takes a PWM input. You don't need any chips on the back of the board if you weren't doing a doubling scheme. So, though what you could have done is take one PWM signal and shove it into 2 power stages in parallel, which would be just like, that would be awful because that would effectively make the VRM a 4 phase here if they did that. But no, they're running a doubling scheme with what is probably a 3599. So this, technically speaking, it's not a real 8 phase, but it's a hell of a lot closer to being an 8 phase than, you know, a lot of what you see on other motherboards. It has much less in common with a 4 phase than it has in common with an 8 phase. So I'm okay with EVGA calling this an 8 phase, and for the purposes of this video, we'll just call it an 8 phase because at least all the phases are out of phase with each other. Because some other motherboard vendors, they'll just smack twice as many components and then shove one PWM signal into 2 phases and go like, yeah, they're out of phase with each other. Not at all. But yeah, so I'm cool with EVGA calling this 8 phase. Now, the TDA 88240, it's, as I said earlier, from Infineon. It's a 35 amp DR MOS power stage. And the thing about these guys is there's no public data sheet. So instead of using the data sheet for these, because I don't have it, I've gone and found I went and used the TDA 21241, because I have a data sheet for this thing. It's also 35 amps, and it's also from the same product family. So it should be relatively close in terms of efficiency to the TDA 88240s here. But there might be some differences in like efficiency versus switching frequency, or like overall efficiency in general. Like the TDA 88240s might be slightly more efficient. I'm not sure. There's no public data sheet for them, so I can't say. But using the data sheet for the 35 for the TDA 21241s, this VRM is actually pretty damn powerful. So for a 5.1 gigahertz 8700K, so we'll just go 700K here, 1.42 volts, which is the maximum voltage you should use for like a daily overclock, and 5.1 at 1.42, that's about like an average 8700K. At that kind of voltage and frequency, you should be looking at around 150 amps of output current for the VRM. And in that scenario, this VRM will produce about 18.5 watts of heat, which, if you remember, which is also at 500 kilohertz switching frequency. Though the switching frequency might, like lower switching frequency, might actually benefit these guys. So I'm, again, not sure. But 500 kilohertz is where the TDA 21241s would do it. Now, the 18.5 watts, that's actually significantly better than the Z370G that we looked at, like the Strix board that we looked at, because if my memory serves me correctly, that thing was around 22 watts for this same current value, which I think I actually had that video at 140. But still, if it was at 22 watts at 140, then it would have just been worse if I ran it at 150. Which, yeah, anyway. So this is, significantly more efficient, but it also has the benefit of the VRM being relatively spread out, and these heatsinks actually have a surface area because there's fins on there. Look at that. EVGA knows what a heatsink is supposed to look like. I mean, it's not got the most surface area ever, but it's significant. It looks a lot better than what you get on most motherboards. So I'd be inclined to believe that this VRM should have no problem in terms of cooling. And the other thing that EVGA has done here is that they've actually put like the hotspots of the VRM really far apart, right? Like you have half the vCore, like you have basically half of that 18.5 watts is going to be up here, and the other 18.5 watts is going to be down here. Whereas if you had the entire VRM in a, like a line like that, and you had all 8 phases in one line, then right in the center of that, you'd have a really bad hotspot, which instead you basically would have a hotspot right around there and around there for the design they have here. So, yeah, I think, completely acceptable. And actually, this is probably the best micro ATX motherboard for Z370 in terms of VRM. I'm not sure how good the BIOS is. EVGA tends to have a... Like, with the with the X299 Dark, I'm actually really, really pleased with that board. And even when I first got it, it wasn't as good as it got with some updates. Like the most recent, like the more recent BIOSes are way better than what that board originally had. So I'm not sure if the Z370 Micro might not have a similar situation where it's just like they rolled it out with a BIOS which is sort of okay, but not, incredible. But anyway, as far as the VRM is concerned, at least, this is really, really solid. Now then, going up, 5.4 gigahertz, 1.5 volts. Now, this would be actually like a really good CPU, and that is definitely a voltage you should only push for benchmarking runs only. At that point, you should be looking at around 170 amps current output for AVX workloads, and the VRM will produce about 24 watts of heat, which, that might actually get the VRM again, total guesstimate for the capabilities of these heat sinks, but judging by the like thermal results I've gotten with boards in the test bench so far, this should have at that point this might start getting close to around 100 degrees Celsius on the back of the board. So yeah, this should actually be still really doing pretty damn well in terms of VRM temperature. Now then, so that's for sort of your ambient, you know, so that's like your daily overclock where it does just fine. Then for benchmarking on like water cooling, it might get warm, but since this is just benchmarking only, I'd say just figure out how to jam a fan on the VRM. Like, you know, it's not a permanent installation. Like this is not something you're going to be running long term, so you might as well throw a fan on there. Now for LN2 overclocking. Oh wait, no. Before we get to the LN2, because we don't know what the name is going to be, but the rumor is that it's going to be the 9700K. That's going to be an 8-core, and it's still going to be on the 14 nanometer manufacturing process. So I'm going to have it as a guess that that's going to do 5.1 gigahertz, maybe a tad more. I don't know if Intel plans to add another plus to the end of their 14 nanometer. 5.1, 1.42, and what was it? 200 amps, because that would basically be like, if you look at like KB Lake does like 5 gigahertz at 1.42 volts, 100 amps. Coffee Lake does 5.1 gigahertz, 1.42 volts, 150 amps. So you basically get 50% more current pull for your 2 extra cores, which is 50% more cores than what you had on the 7700K. So assuming that that just keeps going the way it's going right now, which it probably should, because again, it's still going to be some iteration of Intel's 14 nanometer. The 9700K is probably going to be pulling around 200 amps. At that point, this board will produce about 28 watts of heat, and I think the heat sinks would start getting a workout at that point. Again, you know, the fact that this VRM is like split into 2 sections like this should be hugely beneficial, and these do seem to have a like solid amount of surface area, but that's a good amount of heat, and that's actually so that might actually be a problem on this board if it started pushing like 200 amps. So yeah, that would actually need testing. Now then, LN2 level power draws. So I just did this for the 8700K, and it's a very rough estimate of what one should pull. So we're talking 1.8 volts, 240 amps-ish. I'm not entirely sure about that number. It might be higher, it might be lower. The problem is once you start drastically changing the operating temperature of a CPU, the power consumption can drop by, you know, like 30+%. Depending on how cold it is, and then it also varies with architectures, because a lot of the time, like if you look at like as your temperature increases, your power consumption does something like this. So basically, you know, and if here is if here's 0 degrees, then that's still, you know, Coffee Lake can run at like, oops, if that was 0 and this was minus 200. Well, Coffee Lake can run in like this area, so that's still a pretty significant drop, and that's still a massive drop against, say, which actually, like there, that would be like 100, right? Because roughly half that distance, yeah. So you get the idea. So that's a pretty significant drop right there from that massive change in temperature. So that's why I have like this is really rough. Basically, it's mostly a guess. But at 240 amps, 1.8 volts, you'd be looking at about 40 watts of VRM heat output, which, well, it's on LN2. So basically what happens is this area of the motherboard, while it's sitting at idle, freezes over. Like, it is completely normal that, like, your memory sticks get covered in ice, that your VRM gets covered in ice, that your power connectors get covered in ice, and like the longer you run on liquid nitrogen with a architecture that has no cold bug, like Coffee Lake, basically the more frosted the entire upper area of the motherboard becomes. So that 40 watts figure, like basically as long as the benchmark isn't too long, it shouldn't cause problems, because the whole thing will have to first defrost before it actually starts overheating, and that takes a while. So yeah. Overall, I'd say really, really solid Vcore VRM right there. Like, for a micro ATX motherboard, this is probably the best on Z370. Because I can't think of any other motherboard that I saw that had a similarly capable VRM. Most of them are like a 4-phase posing as an 8, whereas this is a 4-phase doubled into an 8. which this is basically an 8, whereas that isn't. That is a 4, what you find on most of the other boards. So yeah, that's the Vcore VRM. Now the VCCSA just uses another one of the TDA 88240s, and that's all I really care to say about that, because VCCSA should never exceed more than 10 amps current output, which is just nothing. So it's going to be like 1 or 2 watts of heat output on that single phase right there. VCCIO pulls even less current than VCCSA, but this does use 2 discrete MOSFETs and a different drive and a different voltage controller. So the voltage controller here is a UP1537, which is a single phase driver. No, not driver. Single phase voltage controller with a built-in driver. There, that's what's going on. So it actually, there's no driver chip here because this directly powers its own MOSFETs. And the MOSFETs here are the, well, actually, this one's going to be the high side. I can't actually tell from this far up which one's which, but let's just say this one's high, this one's low. The high side one is a 4C10N from On Semiconductor, the favorite high side MOSFET, cheapo high side MOSFET, which is fine. You know, VCCIO doesn't push much current, so this is not a problem. There are motherboards that use a lot worse than that for VCCIO. And the low side MOSFET is a 4C05, which is actually a pretty, that's actually pretty high for the VCCIO rail, because there's a lot of boards where they'll just do 2 of those, where they'll have a high side 4C10 and then a low side 4C10 as well. But this goes up to the C05, which is a much lower RDS on, though slower, which is why it's a low side MOSFET. So that's what's going on there. Then you have memory power, and the memory VRM is a, what was it? It's a bit of a mess, because I've scribbled all over it. So we'll just take the scribbles off. There we go. Memory VRM is this thing right here. And this this board's kind of interesting because I have a lot of pictures of it. So there's also this down here. This, I'm going to assume, is for the PCH. So that's going to power the PCH over there. This right here is that's a UP 1740S. Is it? Yeah, 1740S, and that is probably doing VPP, which is the supporting rail for DDR4, though it can actually do VTT, it can actually do VDDQ, so it can do, well, VDDR slash VDDQ, since that's like the datasheet name, that's the common name, and that's what people call it, because this is what you get on your that's the voltage spec on your memory sticks. So the UP1740S down here is probably doing VPP, because otherwise this wouldn't have to exist. Because normally this thing is actually capable of doing VDDR as well as, VDDR. And it also does VTT voltages. So this is like a fully integrated memory VRM, basically, with there's 2 LDOs for the minor rails, and then there's the VDDR voltage, which is generated with the inductor over there. But here I think it's just being used for VPP because there's this thing for VDDR. And that's controlled by this chip down here. Yes, it is, because that is a filter. Like, this keeps confusing me right here, because that looks like it would be a fully integrated buck converter, but no, that's some kind of LDO up there, and I'm not sure what it's actually powering. But this chip down here is a UP 1537 again. Do I have the name right? Yeah, that's another 1537, and you have the same MOSFETs as for the VCCIO, so 4C10N, so basically what you see on a lot of other motherboards out there, and the low side is another 4C05, which is actually a decent upgrade compared to most motherboards, because again, most boards will just slam a 4C10N for both, or sometimes they'll put 2 4C10Ns in parallel, which would actually, I'm not sure, I can't remember the ratings off the top of my head, but it would be, it would get pretty close to this, I think, or might even be better. But either way, like, VDDR doesn't push enough, like, your memory doesn't pull enough power for this really to matter, which is why the MOSFETs on this are always cheap, even on like top end motherboards. Well, unless you're ASRock. ASRock puts like 40 amp freaking dual NFETs on this thing, but everybody else just buy like the cheapest MOSFET they have in stock. That's what they'll slap on for VDDR, because this is really, really low power. So that's that up there. And finally, for your extreme overclocking voltages, you have this down here. And this is well, this stuff down here. And this is kind of interesting. So you have this chip right here, which is a UP8801, and that's a 3 amp LDO. So that, I don't know what voltage that generates though. So basically the voltages this would generate would be like things like VCC PLL underscore OC, then just VCC PLL itself, I think there's a DMI voltage on Coffee Lake. I don't remember right now, because there's like a bunch of voltages for extreme overclocking, which are very, very low power. But if you don't fine tune them, the system won't boot under minus 120, basically. Well, actually, kind of depends on the CPU, but most CPUs will just completely lock up around minus 120. And when that happens, you need to like dial in very, very specific values for your VCC PLL OC, VCC PLL, and a couple other voltages. And basically these LDOs down here, which these I assume are LDOs, it's kind of an odd package to put an LDO in, because it doesn't really look big enough. But those are UP8815s, and I can't get a data sheet for those. But they're still from that same, like they're from a family of like the 88 series for UP semiconductor. UPI semiconductor is a bunch of LDOs, so I'm assuming that's still an LDO, yeah, so those would give you control over the extreme overclocking voltages, though I'm not sure if they're actually accessible in the BIOS. That's the other thing. But at least the board has these, because normally a lot of boards, what they'll do is they'll just set them like fixed, and when they're fixed, then you get into issues with basically not being, well, like you go to minus 100 and minus 120 and you're done. Like you can't go lower because you can't change these voltages, because the board physically doesn't have the circuitry necessary to do it. So this board definitely has all the necessary equipment to push an 8700K on LN2. I'm just not sure if it would, like, again, it would depend on like how well the BIOS is implemented. But physically, I like what I'm seeing. Like, I really like what I'm seeing. Like, I was actually very strongly considering buying this board until I realized Z390 is coming pretty soon. And, yeah, but solid board. Probably the best micro ATX motherboard on Z370. Assuming EVGA has got the BIOS under control. Because a lot of the time, that's where well, I've seen people complain about EVGA's way of handling the load line, where they have you can turn the V-droop on or you can turn the V-droop off, which makes perfect sense if you've read like an Intel data sheet and actually understand it. But for the average user, that makes zero bloody sense, because it does, like all the other boards, you know, they have like LLC level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you know the reverse as well. So, yeah. And then also, EVGA also has a tendency of sometimes not, like, for memory overclocking, there's sometimes missing settings, and that gets kind of problematic. But, again, hardware-wise, I'm very, very, very pleased with what I'm seeing. You have heat sinks that look like they can actually, you know, dissipate heat, not just store it in their thermal mass, though I still think these could probably have a bit more surface area, but this is really more this is much closer to what you would see in like a server VRM heatsink than, you know, your average gaming motherboard. And then just like this is a solid board. Like I like it. It's very, very kind of stripped down. You know, no RGB on it. There's some troubleshooting LEDs. You have your postcode. The one thing I do miss is there's no retry button, there's no safe boot, and there's no slow mode. I really wish those were here, but like the flip side is that with EVGA boards, you actually have a ton of BIOS profiles. Like, you can save, like, on the dark, they store, like, 14 profiles, which is, I think, the highest amount of profile saves I've seen on any motherboard. So basically, as long as you just make sure you keep saving profiles all the time, it's not like you should run out of space. If you're used to using something like an Asus or a Gigabyte or an ASRock board where you normally have like 6 profiles max, yeah, you shouldn't run out of space if you're used to having 6 profiles available, because you'll have 14 here. So as long as you keep saving profiles, the lack of a safe boot isn't a huge problem. Though if you don't keep track of saving profiles, you're going to have to start over a lot, because your only option for recovery is the clear CMOS up there. So yeah, that's it for this board. How did this video end up 35 minutes? Oh boy. Like, seriously, I was hoping for this to be like 20, and oh well, that's it. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can leave them down in the comment section below. What else is there? Right, if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a PayPal, a Patreon, and there's t-shirts you can buy. There's a link to all of that down in the description below. One link for all of those. And yeah, that's it for the video. So thanks to Rave for, you know, sending in the pictures of the board. Because this is definitely like one of the boards that I really wanted to cover. Because like when I first saw it announced, I was like, EVGA might actually be serious about extreme overclocking motherboards again. And this just kind of confirms it more. So the only question left is, like, how is the BIOS? Which I guess I won't ever know. Well, I've put in a request for the board. I'm not sure if I'll actually get it. I'm definitely not going to buy it because Z390 is coming out in, like, I don't know, a couple months. And it seems like a really dumb idea to, you know, buy a Z370 board now, just when Z390 is going to come out and make all the Z370 boards basically irrelevant from a sort of like attention perspective, right? Like, if you upload a video about Z390, it'll get more views than Z370. So yeah, that's it for the video, and thanks for watching, and goodbye.